May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. Now, as many of you know, I love the Holy Land, and I've been on several pilgrimages there. And it is awesome to walk in the footsteps of Moses and Miriam and Aaron and the many prophets and Mary and Elizabeth and John the Baptist and Jesus and his apostles. And I don't have words to fully describe what that experience is like to be in what is now modern-day Israel and the Palestinian territories. Jerusalem and Nazareth and the West Bank and Bethlehem and the Mount of the Beatitudes and the place of the multiplication of loaves and fishes and more. And it saddens me deeply to witness the present-day destruction of life and livelihood and the many struggles over the land in this place called holy. And I imagine God, in God's infinite compassion, is weeping, even as God wept at the time of Jesus. Now, in our gospel today, Jesus and his apostles, who need rest and recuperation big time, were headed for Gennesaret. And Gennesaret is a beautiful place situated on the Sea of Galilee. It's in a small bay. And even today, people go there for the beauty of the scenery. It's quiet and peaceful. And I'm sure that was why Jesus was headed there. In the gospel today, it clearly states that Jesus needed downtime. And if you look at what has been going on for Jesus and the apostles in Mark's gospel, you can imagine how exhausted he and his disciples were. He's fed 5,000 people, he's healed the sick, he's taught, and he's visited many people, and Jesus is grieving his cousin John the Baptist's death. You remember John the Baptist was murdered by Herod in a very violent way. He was beheaded. And I imagine that Jesus is brokenhearted. I would be. And many of us experience that kind of grief when we lose someone that we love. And I also wonder if Jesus is wondering or realizing how dangerous his own work is becoming. But whatever the case, Jesus senses that he and his disciples need a break, some peace and some quiet and some solitude. Jesus says, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while, to get away from the crowds, because they've just been on them all the time. So, Jesus and the disciples, tired and weary and emotionally and physically exhausted, they go. And I think an important part of hearing this gospel is it very much focuses on Jesus' humanity. It focuses on Jesus' humanity. Because I wonder sometimes if, as followers of Jesus, our tendency is to focus on the godliness of Jesus and not the humanity of Jesus. And yet there are passages in the gospel, transitions and verses which often precede and follow these main events in Jesus' life, his life story, which show us how human he is. Luke tells us Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Mark tells us the next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Matthew says Jesus was sleeping. Mark says he didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in. So these verses are a window into Jesus' human life, the life that mirrors our lives as well. So just like us, sometimes Jesus needs to withdraw. He has this human need for solitary prayer and to eat and to sleep and to have alone time and to spend time away from his ministry. So even as we believe that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, his human needs don't take away from being God's son. Writer Debbie Thomas says that of these mundane but crucial ways, our God is like us. It's that gift of the incarnation. Jesus hungers and sleeps and eats and rests and withdraws and grieves just like we do. And Thomas goes on to say, Jesus, also like us, is also like us, in that sometimes his best laid plans go a different direction. According to Mark, Jesus' retreat by boat idea fails. It fails. The crowds anticipate his plan. They follow him on foot. And by the time he and his disciples reach that quiet destination, the crowds are waiting. And the quiet sanctuary that Jesus seeks is nowhere to be found. So imagine that Jesus is like a contemporary rock star. Think of Taylor Swift, right? Someone from the first century who has this celebrity status. And as soon as that boat lands, the crowds go wild, and they're pushing and jostling to get close to Jesus. And they carry their sick to him on mats. And then in every village, even as Jesus tries to find a place to rest, in every village and every city, swarms of people are approaching Jesus. They need healing. They need healing. And they press against him, and they plead and they beg to touch just the fringe of his robe and receive that healing. Now, what does Jesus do? Does he run? I have sometimes, I bet you have too. Does he turn the boat around and sail away? No, he doesn't. As Mark puts it, Jesus saw the huge crowd, and he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion. He had compassion on them. So he began to teach them and to heal them. The gospel says, all who touched him were healed. So Jesus recognized the needs of the people. He didn't take a pass on compassion. He didn't take a pass on compassion. He could have said, let someone else be compassionate today. I'm all compassion out. But he didn't. Because the people who came to him couldn't wait for the next day. They couldn't wait. They had been waiting for such a long time. And they couldn't wait for the next prophet to come along. The people had immediate needs, and their lives depended on Jesus' compassion. I think one of the tensions in this week's gospel is between compassion and the need to take care of oneself and family. And we live in this tension just as Jesus did. Writer Debbie Thomas says, Jesus was unapologetic about his need for rest and for solitude. He didn't see any shame in retreating when he and his disciples needed a break. But on the other hand, he never allowed his weariness to overwhelm his compassion and his desire to show love for others. So what's the lesson in this for us? I think certainly Jesus calls us to strive for balance in our lives and to recognize that it's okay to recognize when we are weary and to recognize when we need time to recharge and to recognize when we need more prayer time and to recognize when we need to leave that crowd behind. Remember, Jesus never apologizes for being human or having human needs. He recognizes his own humanity. But Jesus recognizes something else. While trying to live a balanced life is the ideal, it's not always possible. And I think one of the key messages from today's gospel is this, that as followers of Jesus, we have human needs that we must tend to. And this is a big and, that's modeled by Jesus, we must always have compassion towards people in need. Because Jesus is always compassionate, even when he's most exhausted. And while we recognize our own human need for rest and renewal, we must also recognize that Jesus calls us to never cease to be compassionate. Compassionate. Compassion is the presence of God in Jesus, and compassion is the presence of Jesus in us. Amen.